Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, editor-in-chief of CraftsmanOnline.com, and we meet back together to discuss Masonic degree charges. Not Masonic charges, Masonic degree charges, as this would be a much more pleasant conversation with our guest this week, Brother John Nagy. Welcome back, Brother Nagy.
Thanks again for having me, Brother Michael.
What I've always found interesting about this, and before we get into the history of the charges and the words that are in there, is just kind of their placement in our ritual. They come at the very end of what I think a lot of us would say a degree night is a very long night. Wouldn't you agree?
You think they'd shorten it down, but in all honesty, degrees are not that long. The third degree is obviously long, and once you have 5 or 6 candidates going through, it becomes even longer. But the first and second degree, if you subtract out the lectures, they're very, very short. Lectures tend to drag them out. And then you bookmark it with an order to boot, and you wind up lengthening them for sure.
And that's the part of the Masonic charges that I wanted to get into, is kind of the origin of them. The more that we attend degrees as Master Mason and we retrace those steps that we took early in our journey of becoming a Sublime Master Mason, we begin to see the distinction where the first part of the ritual focuses around the obligation, or I should say the first part of the degree focuses on the ritual, the floor work, the obligation, and all the symbolism that's packed into that, literally, that sometimes the candidate can see and other times it's revealed to them later. The second part of the degree is almost the second half of oratory. Where did this all come from? Because my guess is that it wasn't one guy with a pen who said, hey, I got an idea.
A lot of competition in the 1700s between lodges trying to entice and bring forth individuals who would attend because they wanted to be entertained and provoked thought-wise. And so you had a bunch of traveling lecturers going from one lodge to the next and attracting members into the fold, so to speak. In fact, Preston was very, very notorious for switching from one Grand Lodge to another because of various things that unfolded during his time. And as a result, he would lecture and he put together huge, long, laborious lectures that would attract members who wanted to hear something that was significant to them. And so, yeah, he's one of a multitude of individuals who used to travel as a lecturer, but he predominantly created these lectures for one main purpose, and that is to bring members into the lodge that would stick around for the next lecture.
I know my answer to this question is no, I don't. Do you have any recollection of the words or any of the meanings, the teachings that came in the charge when you were going through your degrees?
Oh, yes. Each and every one. I can't say that I recalled every last bit of them, but I can say there were things that stood out for me. The entered apprentice degree charge, where they basically said you're charged to study the sacred law. Well, as an ordained minister, that kind of stood out. So it was like, oh, well, okay, now I got permission. And I liked the aspect of not countenancing disloyalty or rebellion. I am a loyalist to my countrymen, not necessarily to what's going on with the government structure, because some of them are just absolutely full as bozo as far as the way that they're running the country right now. I'm pointing out anyone in particular, but there's some craziness going on with the governing structure, but I am loyal to my countrymen. And so when I heard that, I said, yep, yeah, I can get on board with that real easy. And there was an aspect of it where they were talking about um, not allowing Freemasonry to interfere with my outside activities. And, that harkened back immediately to what I heard during my obligation about the cable tow, that, within the length of my cable tow. And here it is coming back full circle to the charge saying, you participate in Freemasonry, but not to the extent of interfering with your outside activities. And there were two more. I liked the fact that they were saying, effectively, my own interpretation of the words, that, yeah, you can get really zealous about this institution. However, don't suffer your zeal to the point where when you're going to be pulled into an argument because of someone else's ignorance, or perhaps even your own because you're new. And I liked that because it immediately told me, temper thy actions, John. Back to temperance, one of the virtues that I heard during my entered apprentice lecture. And I said, okay, there's another warning that intemperance is not a good thing. And I was very attracted to the latter part where they were talking about in my leisure hours, meaning that not my work, not my family, but the time that is just for myself, improve myself in Masonic knowledge. And I've got to tell you that I have taken that to an extreme over the last 20 years, but not to the point where it was imprudent or intemperate. But I took the ball and ran with that one. So, and that's what I remember about the entered apprentice charge. I just loved what I was hearing, and it made me want to hear more. And then all of a sudden, the charge was over, and they were patting me on the back for becoming a brother. And then I was off to the races with learning the catechism, the proficiencies, and going through another degree soon thereafter.
Studying the charges, one of the things I've noticed is that each jurisdiction, again, has their own way and own words of sharing this. In my home jurisdiction of New York, where our podcast originates, we have two versions of each charge. So we have a total of 6 charges that, yeah, and 2 charges for each of the 3 degrees. And at first, I didn't know that there were 2 different versions of it. I'd only heard one version in my mother lodge, so that was the version that I knew. And the first time that I heard it, what was unique to me about it was the way that it was delivered, where instead of it being a ritual or an initiation experience, it was almost like when I was younger and I would get a lecture from my father with my younger brother after we had done something to disappoint him, like brought home a report card with bad grades, or get that uncomfortable call home from school, and he would sit us down and tell us what we had done that was wrong and why we needed to be doing something. And I just remember the words that were, and it was very stern. Not for my dad, but he was this way as well. But it was, the brother was very measured with his tone, and I understood why it was referred to as the charge later, because in the first degree, I remember being charged to be a good citizen, to be a good member of the community, to be a good man. Those were, if I was to list that's what I remember from that. By the time we get to the second and the third degree, I remember at some point, bowing to the letter G, and then after the third degree, all bets are off, because there was so much information that came that afternoon after the Heramic Legend that I really don't remember that Masonic charge at all. There was a time when I didn't think there was one for the third degree, but really that one I think kind of surmises the Masonic experience, and I wish that we could share it on a broader scale. We'll get to that one in a little bit, but those were my recollections of it.
I concur. It is a bit of a fire hose experience, especially by the third time around.
Yeah. Now, what I think is meaningful for brothers is you get a little bit deeper into learning our symbolic degrees and the ritual, and now you really want to study these words and find out where they come from, and hopefully the real meaning and some of the deeper meaning that's connected to them, right? And that comes with taking a part in the degree. And we've talked about how it's like a play and you're playing a part, which I understand at certain points it is. But I've always found that the brothers that raise their hand to do the Masonic charge, if it's not done by the worshipful master in your jurisdiction, these brothers, they really specialize in this. Like if this was baseball, they are a specialist pitcher that comes in to face one batter and then they go right to the bench afterwards.
It amazes me as to how an individual can internalize a group of words and convey them in such a passionate way that the recipient receives more than just words. They receive the energy and the intention and the context that the individual is attempting to convey in such a way that the person is swayed. But that's the whole art of rhetoric. And when you get to the point where you're studying the 7 liberal arts and sciences, rhetoric or rhetorical study is the whole delivery. You're attempting to persuade the listener, and that is part of rhetoric. And an individual who has committed the words to not only their mind but also their heart, it's no longer coming from their head, their lips, it's coming from their heart. And if they deliver it in such a way that the individual who hears it is touched, they've done their job.
As we mentioned, the charges in Freemasonry were originally recorded by James Anderson when he published the Constitutions of Freemasons in 1723. We're going to provide a link to that in the show links for this episode. In these original charges, they cover about 5.5 pages of text, very similar to what we would experience now in our symbolic lodges, but I would say more of a inspiration of what you would hear in today's modern, or what we would call standard work and ritual. As I mentioned, there's 2 versions that are in existence here in New York. The first I would refer to as our New York version because it's very influenced with Old English words that you don't hear every day in conversation anymore. And then the second, I would say, is more of the Duncan's ritual, the ritual that has been revealed and is widely available to anyone who can order Duncan's ritual on Amazon for like $7 or whatever it is these days. And they can see what the meanings are and read more about it. It's in plain English. It's one of the very few pieces of our ritual that would be unciphered, that just anyone could pick up the book and read it. We had kind of talked about, where they came from, but I'd like to get a little bit more into the altering it over time, because if we have 2 versions in New York and we change our ritual every couple of years, and there's officers that have this, and I'm not making light of it. There's a grand lecturer, there's a standard work committee, there's brothers who are dedicated to always improving the ritual. Is it possible that this will continue to get modernized as Freemasonry progresses through time?
Well, if history is any measure on that, you will see a continuous innovation as years go by. Someone will be in outer Slobovia and hear the version that they came up with, and what they'll do is they'll take some of that pollen and bring it back to good old Tampa Bay, and they'll share it with the brothers, and perhaps somebody in the Grand Line will hear it, or somebody on the education committee will hear it, and that pollination will take root, and there'll be some seeds that'll sprout from that. You have charges that vary all across the globe. And keep in mind that if you really want to do some history on this, take a look at the Regis manuscript or Halliwell manuscript back from the late 1300s, when English was just taking root out of the transition from the royalty from French to English, which is now the basis of modern English. The reason you don't see many English texts before that is because English did not exist as we know it back in the past beyond that point. So you have the Regis manuscript, which if you take a look at some of the headings on top of these things, you'll see the old charges, and you go through them. And if you take a good look, you'll notice that a lot of the stuff that the charges cover today are already covered back in 1390 in this document. And then, of course, you look at Payne's regulations, which came out like a few years before Anderson's constitutions, and you'll notice that what he did was took tremendous poetic license with what was written a few years before and put it into a nice delivered speech, 5.5 pages. And of course, what we have today kind of touches upon Anderson, but it's not exactly the same. He has like 7 different areas of charges having to do with religion and what have you, which, by the way, if you take a look at what it is that Anderson said about religion, you'll notice that he actually defines what that common thread religion is. If you take the what fors and thous and commas and what have you out of that long statement, you'll notice that, the religion that every man will agree is to be a good man, and he literally states, if you decipher it and get rid of a lot of the stuff that he puts in there as conditions, it's to be good men, or at least, and he goes into it and he defines what that common religion is. It's beautiful. It's, for a minister, he really did a wonderful job of masking what he was defining as religion, particularly that all men would agree to. And I liked it.
Another cool thing about the charges is they're part of that surviving document or surviving text between the war between the ancients and the moderns in Freemasonry, where we have an idea of who won because that's how our ritual has been affected. Now we have this second half of our degree nights. It's not just the obligation and then we close the lodge.
Absolutely. In the very beginning, there was just the entered apprentice degree, and you were a full-fledged member once you got your entered apprentice degree. And there was something called the master's part, which allowed the Grand Lodge to create a fellowcraft. And all this was echoing Stonecraft, but it was nothing like Stonecraft. And what they did was they split that EA degree into 2. And we've covered this in previous presentations and interviews, but what it comes down to is the evolution from about 1717-ish to even 1725, where you wound up with a Master Mason degree that was created by a bunch of theatrical partiers and taken over by the Grand Lodge. And then you wound up having what I call the Grand Lodge Wars, where you had lecturers basically competing with each other, and the creme de la creme wound up rising to the top. And by the time 1813-ish came around, where the two merged to actually create the United Grand Lodge of England, that was when it was created. It was a different name before then. What you have is a merging of all these beautiful things that were created in a very, very gentlemanly like competition between the Grand Lodges. And we have some beautiful things that have been created as a consequence of that, including in not being limited to the perfect ashlar, which was really an innovation around 1813, when the 2 Grand Lodges came together and they started canonizing what we have now as the Preston Webb style ritual. We had the perfect ashlar appear out of nowhere. It's like, whoa, innovation, but it's like, oh no, time immemorial.
In a previous episode, we were talking about the history of craft masonry and the differences between speculative and operative masons, and where did this all come from, and the stonecutters guilds. And What was interesting in doing some research and walking the dog and then observing a first degree and the time since we've had that discussion, I sat there and thought about it. I was like, what was really cool about the Stonecraft guilds back in the day is they did have a religious theme behind them. They would have these feasts, usually to the saint that the guild was dedicated to. So the Saints John were extremely popular at that time, and each guild, I should say, would put on a play, a form of entertainment, because this is back when, they traveled around with carts and horses. And that is what would draw an audience, and people would attend, and that's what would lead people to want to join. And you and I were talking about this privately afterwards, and the idea came to me after I watched the glazed over look from newly obligated entered apprentices who, by the time they heard the historical lecture and now they're getting this charge dropped on them, too much. And I thought, wow, if this is one of the most powerful parts of Freemasonry, if you really read these charges, it sums up what it means to be a Mason, what the fraternity means, what the craft means, like all of the good parts of our experience. Why can't we share this publicly? Why aren't we using the charges to, and I don't want to use the word recruit because people look down on that, but why aren't we using these charges to promote or share the experience that you go through as a Freemason?
It's interesting that out of all the things that we protect as Masons in our ritual, that the charges are one of the few things that we allow to escape into the public. We have monitors where it's all written out with very, very few words masked whatsoever. So if anybody got a hold of these charges, which many people have, it would be out in the open, and they would have absolutely a clear understanding of what our brothers are being charged to do. And what they're being charged to do is extremely moral, extremely patriotic, extremely godly, in the sense that if you are a man of deep faith, all that these charges do is affirm what you ought to be doing as a individual of faith does anyway. So in a way, we're kind of doing that indirectly. I mean, we're not going out there and shoving it down anybody's throats, but good God, if you wanted to really know what they are, I Googled these charges today just to kind of give a quick overview, saying, okay, did I miss anything? Did I forget anything? And no, I've heard these at least 100 or so times before, and it's just like the first time it hits my heart. And just type in the words and they're there. So what kind of promoting would we be doing? We're pretty much putting out in the open already.
Right. Well, my idea was to do a dinner, like a brother bring a friend night event. I think a lot of us are familiar with that concept in our lodges in Freemasonry, but write a play or some sort of sequence that could be acted out, a drama, very short, that would revolve around the lessons in the charges, and would basically be a story that somebody would watch and see because this is a question we get asked a lot. Well, how does Freemasonry make men better? And I think if you pointed to these 3 charges that we have, if you don't walk away from reading that going, I've got the answers, or at least I have some of the answers that they're talking about, then maybe Masonry is not right for you.
Nothing would please me more than to have an opportunity to have what I call pre-Masons, people who are kind of exploring and putting their toe in the waters of Freemasonry, not quite petitioning, but thinking about it. Nothing would please me more than to invite them into a lodge, step down before, you step down a lodge, you bring them in, and have this kind of presentation where somebody could say, I was once an EA and I was charged with the following, and then have maybe even somebody who is sitting not at a station, but somebody sitting in the sidelines stand up and give a short overview of what an entered apprentice is charged with. And then have another brother stand up and say, well, I was once a fellow craft, and here's what I was charged with then. And just so on and so forth, and have the pre-Masons surrounded by the orders that an individual would have to go through in order to obtain the Master Mason level. I don't believe that they're secrets, so it wouldn't be spoiling it for anybody. So what the impact might be, who knows? If it's done in a very tactful, very entertaining, and very thought-provoking way, it may very well grab somebody's interest enough to say, I want to be part of that. I know that if I heard those charges in advance, it would be a little scary, but me being somebody who aspires to betterment, it would be now a goal for me to obtain if I had never heard them before. And it would give me a great understanding of what it is that I would be asked of as a member.
I love the idea. I was going to say, we have the unicorns around the campfire. We haven't visited that tribe in this episode yet.
Let me bring up a unicorn for you, my brother. The aspect of the unicorn rears its ugly head in many, many Masonic circles. And one of them is the favorite battle cry, thou shalt not judge. And I, like that little cartoon meme that you say, just you want to say something. And I go back to talking about how we're not to palliate or aggravate the offenses of your brother, but you are to make sure that in every trespass against our rules, you are to judge with candor, admonish with friendship, and reprehend with justice. And that little word snuck in there about, you are to judge with candor. And all of a sudden, the argument, well, the Bible says you shouldn't judge. And then you get into a wonderful conversation about the unicorns that they're imagining it in what Jesus had said in the New Testament, or has been quoted to have said. And if you read the entire thing within context, it doesn't say that you shouldn't judge. It says you shouldn't judge as a hypocrite. And, that is beautifully spelled out with you are to judge with candor, which basically means you don't want to be a hypocrite when you're judging, but it does say you are to judge. And which a lot of individuals who are ignorant of the New Testament, they believe that they hear that first phrase, thou shalt not judge, and they don't realize within context, Jesus was basically saying you're not supposed to judge as a hypocrite, because in every statement that you make that is a judgment of another person, you will be judged in the same manner by others. So if you're going to judge, you want to make sure that the judgment that you're putting forth is by the same standards that which you want to be judged by. And that's where that judgment with candor comes into place. And, that you brought the unicorns. There's one right there.
For pillar officers that are planning their year in the East, or just lodges that are looking to try something different, you floated out a legitimate and original idea. And I think that an interested gentleman that is looking to petition a lodge, and hopefully it would be yours, would sit there and walk away that night saying, hearing these men talk about specific parts of what it was like for them to become a Freemason is much better than going around the room and each guy saying, I've been a Mason for 7 years, and sitting down. I've been a Mason for 20 years, or whatever the case may be. Not to take anything away from that.
Well, you have to always add, well, I've been a Mason for 20 years and we never had any of this sharing my day. Not in my years.
I was waiting for that one. Oh. I can't really say that they're ancient words, because as we've shared throughout this podcast, is they have been updated over time, but they're relevant words, they're meaningful words, and To some, they are the most cherished and powerful words that we have in all of our ritual. And it's a bit of a shame that they're buried almost at the end of the night during our degrees. Let's not just read our books every once in a while, once a year, and remember these words. Let's not just be charged to live by these words, but let's find a way. Let's bring these words into our lodge, into discussion, so that other brothers can reap the benefits of them. This has been the Craftsman Online podcast. I want to thank our returning champion for again visiting him this week, Brother John Nagy.
That's quite a charge you put down there.
If Masonic education is important to you, you can sign up for our email newsletter at craftsmanonline.com. New episodes of our podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.